It's my pleasure to speak on this subject. I have to let you know that the research I'll talk about today, I conducted before becoming interested in Buddhism and before studying Buddhism. So my focus on compassion was based on some of the literature and also an intuitive sense that it might be very helpful to teach people how to be compassionate towards others, particularly in some cases for individuals who might be prone to depression. So that was the initial foundation for this research. So today, what I want to talk about, I'll give you my main objectives. We know that as a species, we could be exceptionally pro-social. By pro-social, I mean kind, nice, cooperative, but we're also shockingly cruel at times. And we have to account for both. So I'd like to talk about some of the barriers to a compassionate mindset, and that's going to broadly cover mood traits, judgments. I'll talk about how one might enhance compassionate skills and use positive psychology exercises, which are exceptionally simple, brief, and they have significant effects on mood and symptoms of depression, as we'll see. And then I'll get more specific about fitting people to particular activities in order to enhance the effectiveness of these positive psychology exercises. And I'll spend some time talking about disagreeableness because it was one of the personality variables that came out very strongly in my data analyses as profiting the most from compassion exercises. So that was an interesting finding, and I'll focus on that towards the end. But let me start with the evolutionary perspective on compassion. And, you know, we've heard about the selfish gene, but other theorists really claim that we are born to be good and that empathy is really intrinsic to our nature and wired into our nervous system. So with respect to biology and evolution, Darwin was the first to notice that, and to state actually, that communities with sympathetic members would have the greatest reproductive success. That was over 100 years ago. And this is a strong statement. It's kind of saying that people governed by a cooperative interest are going to be more successful than those who are governed by self-interest. And so this is about those tribes that have a collective aim and goal that they would somehow flourish and leave us with this trait, which is then considered to be intrinsic to our nature. And we have seen that empathy is hardwired in the human nervous system. It's also part of other species, and it motivates action to alleviate the suffering in another. And one thing that is also to be noted in favor of this evolutionary model is that we see intuitive pro-sociality. By this, we mean that experiments that have been done, very well-controlled experiments in labs, have shown that when people are prevented from thinking too much about a decision or a choice, when they're time limited in making a decision, they act cooperatively. They will choose to help someone under constraints, cognitive constraints. When you give them more time what's interesting, when people have a chance to deliberate, they're less cooperative. They start to factor in their own self-interests. And so, but you know, the intuitive response is to be helpful. And we see this in young children, as young as 2 years of age. Toddlers are going to offer a hand if somebody needs to pick something from the floor, for example. They notice and they automatically or kind of like naturally will lend a hand to help. And that can't be explained easily through learning when it happens very early. And I think now in infants as well, there's some evidence that there's a perception of distress in others and an interest in that. So this is something that is with us very early on. And I mentioned a little earlier the contrasting aspects of our biological inheritance, which also includes a very competitive, driven, self-interested nature. We see this, right? And when I talked about our ability or our propensity to be cruel, it's not, we don't have to look very far to have examples of that. And we tend to be cruel towards people who are not like us. And so this notion of empathy will sometimes be limited to one's tribe or members of one's group, and then and that can backfire, meaning that there might be antagonism towards other groups. And so we have phenomena that happen that are far from compassionate. We also have individual differences, and this is what I want to focus on. This has been my area of specialty ever since undergraduate. In my honors thesis, I was looking at personality. And with respect to compassion, we see that the amygdala, which was first known to be, it's a very deep structure in the brain. It's like a bean, like it's not very big, it's kind of above the palate. At the very center of the limbic system, we have this amygdala that responds very quickly to threat. And recently it's been recognized that the amygdala also responds to positive cues from the environment. But the amygdala has been found to be instrumental in trait empathy. So individuals that are more empathic, we see the greater activation of the amygdala when they're presented with pictures of distressed individuals, people in pain. Individuals who are higher on trait empathy, more empathic, have their amygdala respond more strongly. So we see this individual difference in response to cues of distress. Now, this is this function of the brain, and particularly this very basic and quick to respond part of our brain, has been studied in relationship to extraordinary altruism. And what we mean by this is like a researcher, the one who has looked at the brain imaging and also the functioning of the brain while you're exposed to distress cues or faces. She looked at individuals who were kidney donors. So imagine giving your kidney to a stranger, and there are such individuals, and she's found enough to do studies on their brain and how they respond to faces that show fear or distress. And she's compared them to psychopaths. So essentially, she's used teenagers in their late teens who met all criteria to eventually become psychopathic. They had conduct disorder in adolescence and were aggressive and had committed criminal acts, but they're still in their late teens. And what she found is that those individuals do not respond to distress in others. They fail to recognize fear and distress. So in other words, they will see someone who is terrified of them probably, and or reacting with a lot of distress and angst, and they can't distinguish that emotion. And so it's no wonder that they're not reacting appropriately in the social world. So this is differences that we see. And what's interesting is this is kind of related to amygdala activity. At one end, we have a lot of activation of the amygdala. At the other end, we have very little, which indicates a lack of response and a lack of recognition. So this is to give you an idea how individual differences are also to some extent wired in. Now, before I get into the psychological literature, I wanted to give a definition of compassion, which is very consistent with the Buddhist definition. The way it's studied in psychology, compassion is defined as a sensitivity to suffering in self and others, and a commitment to try to alleviate it and prevent it. So we see in this definition that there is a cognitive component. You have to perceive the other in need, meaning there's a problem and you're, deserving of help. So deserving of help is to help qualify those instances where an individual who's normally compassionate might not be towards members of an out-group. There's an emotional engagement, feelings of concern and sympathy. The cognitive and the emotional engagement are both lacking with individuals who are on the psychopathic continuum. There is no perception of distress, and there's certainly no need to there's no concern, and there's no need, no motivation to ease the suffering. So the motivational component is not just noticing and being sympathetic, but wanting to help, wanting to ease the distress in the other. Now, one finding, which is really remarkable, is the amount of support for the benefits of being compassionate. And Buddhists would have said that to you, 2,500 years ago, but psychology is now, because we need facts, right? We need data, we need hard evidence. But so recent analyses and meta-analyses linking compassionate traits and states to well-being have found that it's related to greater psychological and physical well-being. So by this, we mean that people feel better, they're less depressed, they're more optimistic, they tend to have a better outlook on life, they report more meaning in life. And so all of these benefits are really worth noting in terms of improving the quality of life. And that's a good rationale as well for trying to implement compassion into our interventions for those who are suffering from symptoms, psychological symptoms. Now, what are inhibitors? What are those states and traits that might block or interfere with this compassion or compassionate ability, this drive to be involved with others distressed? And there's definite experiences, and those are states. And I want to differentiate them from traits, which are more stable. But there are states that make it almost impossible to attend to others, as well as personality variables that suggest that, you're dealing with someone who's less compassionate than others. In terms of states, we know that fear is a big inhibitor. And, some people and I think you will have examples of this. There are individuals who are very empathic, but when they start to become witnesses to other people's problems and distress, they become overwhelmed. And we see this empathic distress as an obstacle. They're so overwhelmed with the suffering in the other that they're unable to help. They can't get closer because of their own simultaneous arousal, and it's hard to manage. So they can't approach as easily. And empathic distress is sometimes found in some individuals with who have codependency, or others who have insecure attachment styles, and I'll get into that soon. But what this refers to, if you want to look at it more biologically, is an unregulated sympathetic arousal, low heart rate variability, and we'll see that when you cultivate compassion, because it can be cultivated, what you develop is more flexibility in terms of your nervous system and your capacity to regulate yourself. So that's one big reason for trying to promote this and working on this for your own benefit. Now, anger is another obstacle. It's anger is there to set boundaries, and it's not only accompanied with irritability, it also comes with judgments about others as undeserving. With anger, we see a lot of blame and finger pointing, and once you have this judgment, it's going to be very hard to be compassionate towards someone. And then finally, for traits, meaning fairly stable characteristics in the individual, which carry over situations and over time. Although it's malleable, some traits are pretty stable. So here, obstacles, inhibitors, we see insecure attachment. Individuals with insecure attachment are going to be either going into empathic distress when somebody else, a close other, significant other, is suffering. Self-criticism also an obstacles because of the judgments that they might have. Feeling unsafe or threatened. So you could feel unsafe in a situation and you're therefore not available to help or to be compassionate. This feeling unsafe could also come from within, right? That could be anxiety. In terms of traits, we have the dark triad in psychology, very well known. These refer to personality styles, including narcissism, sociopathy, and Machiavellism. We know that refers to a minority of the population, although narcissism is a little more common. But this dark triad really refers to the focus on self-interest over collective well-being. Now, disagreeableness is a trait which is a little more common or broad. It's very broad. Disagreeableness is one of those fundamental dimensions of personality. We go from agreeable to disagreeable on this dimension. And this is the trait that I want to focus on, as it is definitely very closely linked with compassion. So who's the disagreeable person? We have trait. Well, let me talk about the poles to make it a little more vivid for you. It's a continuum, right? So that most people are within the average on agreeableness, but we have very agreeable and very disagreeable individuals. So this dimension refers to, okay, I'm not defining it. It refers to a tendency to be warm, empathic, cooperative, to avoid conflict if you're very agreeable, The disagreeable type is antagonistic, non-compliant, self-interested. And what's been found with this variable is that it's been linked to prejudice, so that more agreeable people tend to be lower on prejudice, more likely to help, to cooperate. They want resolution in conflicts. They suppress aggressive impulses. But the disagreeable end, meaning when you're low on trait agreeableness, more self-centered, indifferent to others, and aggressive. That's the general profile. Now, disagreeables have some important function in society, right? We think of the disagreeable boss as, you know, the kind of person who is harsh but fair. They're independent thinkers, non-compliant, they can fire people, no problem. And they tend to be respected often because they're not so easily, you know, influenced by sentimentality. And so they can make objective decisions and be independent in their opinions. So they can elicit a fair amount of respect. But when it comes to relationships and to subjective well-being, we see disagreeableness associated with a lot of problems, not just quarrelsomeness with others, although that's a main trait, but also depression is associated with disagreeableness. So if we were to find a situation that is particularly difficult when it comes to being compassionate, and I want to talk about a study that I conducted a few years ago, and we wanted to know how some people could be compassionate towards depressed individuals and others could be more rejecting of depressed individuals. Now, this is a hard problem because depression typically elicits rejection. People tend to get tired of the depressed individual. And so victims of depression, they provide a context for the study of compassion. Like I said, it's a hard problem to be compassionate when you have a significant other who's depressed. Typically, depression elicits rejection over time because significant others get tired of providing reassurance, of telling them, yes, you're okay, don't worry. You know, there's also the apathy and the lack of engagement when someone is suffering from depression, and it's difficult to continue to be interested in that significant other. So what we did is we looked at agreeableness as one variable that could help determine whether it could stand the test and be related to compassion towards depressed individuals. It's also an opportunity to look at disagreeableness in this context. So we studied trait agreeableness, and in this case, as in most studies, you want to explain why or how something is related to something else. So how could disagreeable individuals be so rejecting of a depressed significant other? And we hypothesized that it's because of stigmatic attitudes. So stigma is like, well, you know, if you're depressed, it's because you're not, you know, trying hard enough. Depression is not a real medical illness. These are examples of stigmatic attitudes that would prevent, you know, empathic concern and compassion towards the depressed other. So these stigmatic attitudes were hypothesized to be one of the reasons that would make disagreeable individuals have less empathy and ultimately reject the depressed person. So we had 2 samples to test these hypotheses, and I'm not going to get into the details too much. I'm noticing the time, and so all you need to know is that these were large samples, and we had a community sample. N refers to the sample size, and you see the constitution here. We have a fairly representative sample, and the depressed other, they were reported to be mostly friends, and then followed by family members and relationship partners. So we were asking these individuals, they were selected on the basis of having a significant other who had been depressed or was currently depressed, and that significant other had to meet certain criteria for us to believe that this was indeed a depressed person in their lives. And they met with this other twice a week or every day, so there was frequent contact. And we asked these participants to complete measures of personality, stigma, empathic concern, and the kind of support that they provided to their depressed significant other. So this is what we found. I know this is going to be confusing. Let me walk you through it. This is a circumplex which captures the interpersonal space between individuals. And we've found in research that it can be understood as being comprised of 2 basic axes. People, in their support towards others and their interpersonal behavior, tend to be more or less dominant. So we have this axis which measures how bossy you're going to be or how avoidant you're going to be with that significant other. The other axis is about how loving, how nurturing you're going to be, or how rejecting or critical you're going to be. And the reason I'm mentioning this circle here is that we had to measure rejection, and it's difficult to ask someone, how rejecting were you of this person? They're not going to tell you I was rejecting them, but we want examples of the kinds of behaviors that they exhibited. So let me give you examples. The findings here is that, let's look at disagreeableness, which is the red patch here on the circumplex. The responses in this area were to questions that involve the following statements. When interacting with their depressed other, they were more likely to say, well, I told them that they would have to learn to live with it. I reminded them that whining doesn't help. I reminded them that people sometimes get what they deserve. I told them that I'm not surprised that they have these problems. So you can hear in this the criticalness and also a little bit of distancing. What we want ultimately is for individuals to be able to be engaging with their significant other regardless of their state. And what this green circle shows here is empathic concern. That variable was related to the following behaviors. I tried to keep in regular contact with them. I tried to involve them in social activities. I checked up on them frequently. So these are behaviors that are a little more dominant, but definitely on higher on love. And it's exactly what you should be doing in order to help a significant other who is depressed. So we see our variables here, and I don't want to overwhelm you. This is just showing you what we were measuring and the fact that we're capturing, this whole idea of a compassionate response versus a rejecting response. And what we found in the following analyses is that those who were higher on disagreeableness endorsed more stigma, were lower on empathic concern, and this predicted their less loving behavior. So these mediational models, again, I don't want to get too caught up in the statistics, but just to show you how psychologists, scientists are going to have to prove their hypotheses is through various data analyses. And here, what the mediational tests were showing is that the reason that disagreeable people are less loving in their reports of their interaction with depressed others is that they also endorse stigmatic attitudes, and they were also less, which predicted lower empathic concern. And therefore, it's not surprising that these two, it's not surprising, but it was also statistically significant that these mediators accounted for less loving behaviors. What this is saying, and for dominance, we obtained also good mediational results. So all this is saying, we got to fight the stigma. You know, if we want to change the judgments that underlie this lack of empathy, we have to deal with judgments that people have about mental illness. And we used depression as an example, but let me give you items that are used to measure stigma. One is people with depression could snap out of it if they wanted. Depression is a sign of personal weakness. Depression is not a real medical illness. It's best to avoid people with depression so you don't become depressed yourself. So, you know, you can see here that there's definitely a prejudice against those individuals. And the stigma could be towards other conditions, other mental illnesses, sexual orientation, social class, body image. We have stigma towards all kinds of conditions, and they always involve a judgment and this attitude that the individual is undeserving of compassion. So it's a real cognitive barrier to empathy and compassionate responding. And in that paper, one thing that I highlighted was how, you know, this becomes a problem for society in general. We could educate people generally in public education campaigns, for example, to help to reduce the stigma and help individuals to see the whole person, not just their condition, but the whole person who is much more like us in the end than we might think. So that was the thrust of that paper. Now I want to mention, okay, so just to support my claim here, we know the Beatles used love 613 times in their songs. So therefore it is important. And is there something we can do with people who are more disagreeable and less compassionate? And briefly, I want to talk about two interventions that I've studied in relationship to levels of agreeableness. I've looked at loving kindness meditation, which was a meditation provide and acts of kindness. And let me give you the methodology. People randomly assigned to loving kindness meditation, acts of kindness, or control condition. This was in the context of positive psychology. So in this case, the distance interventions, it's amazing. You can reach hundreds and thousands of people online if they're willing to participate and agree to do an exercise and follow the protocol. You have a sample. And so these exercises were brief. They were done every other day for 3 weeks. I had over 600 Canadian participants, and the delivery for the exercises was through the internet. They had their own participant login for the study, and they were sent reminders and instructions for their exercises, which they were to do for a 3-week period. And we measured all kinds of variables. We measured the personality, we measured their levels of depression and happiness and life satisfaction at baseline, and 3 weeks later at post-test, and then 2 months later. And what we wanted to see is if the experimental conditions, which was loving kindness meditation or acts of kindness, if the people in those conditions would do better than the participants in the control group. And we found out that they did. Just so you understand what the exercise was, over the next day or two, these are the instructions. Try to actively demonstrate kindness in your interactions with someone who is close to you. Try to behave in a loving or helpful way towards this individual. And what we found is that at post-test, this is the change in depression. And I want to show you for the overall sample. They started off, it's interesting, people are not doing great overall. People are mildly or moderately depressed on average, and or they decide to participate in those kinds of studies because they want some help. But anyway, they start off fairly high on depression scores, and then at post-test, they drop below the cutoff for clinical depression. So there was a very significant change after doing these exercises. And this is the act of kindness exercise. Loving kindness also had a very significant effect. The control groups, they show a little bit of a change, and they fluctuate, but at the end, they're no different than they were at the beginning. Whereas those doing acts of kindness tend to, at the follow-up, continue to be less depressed than they were at baseline. So that's a significant effect for an intervention that's pretty cheap to execute. Now, the real finding was with respect to low agreeableness, or at least I think was the most interesting thing or result. And I'm just going to show you what happened to people who were disagreeable. So that's low agreeableness. This solid bar is the disagreeable Grinch person who's always cranky and not happy. And the solid line is what happens in the acts of kindness condition. So they go down at post-test. They show a greater reduction than people who were more agreeable. And then they go on to show reduction in depression at post-test. 1 month later, 2 months later, they end up at the follow-up being so different from where they started. And this is after 3 weeks of doing the kindness exercise in close relationships. It literally transformed their mood. They start off at 30 with severe depression and end up not clinically depressed. Now, you might be wondering about the other groups or what happens in the loving kindness condition. The loving kindness condition had some effect, immediate effect after the period of doing the exercise, which was 10 minutes of loving kindness meditation with instructions. But they tend to go back to normal 2 months later. So people don't seem to continue to profit from the meditation, at least administered in a brief manner here, tended to have superficial results. And so what this brings us to is finding in positive psychology, finding the right activity for the individual. And here we saw that with disagreeableness, it is so important to engage in a supportive relationship. It benefited the mental health of disagreeable individuals. And the study showed that even after doing the experiment at post-test, they continued to be agents of their own change through deliberative choice, including consideration of the benefits to them. So when you introduce it as a choice and an activity, let's say, to be more compassionate in your close relationships, to demonstrate support to significant others. And these are the relationships where there's more hostility, typically. And, this turned out to be so beneficial, probably because it produced a positive feedback loop in those relationships. Rather than conflict, now there was more compassion. And that really helped the mood of those who were more disagreeable. It helped everybody, but it also was seemed to be beneficial for disagreeable people. It's a value-based framework for cooperation. And engendering compassionate action may gradually reinforce the corresponding trait. And so traits might be malleable. Now, I just want to go back for 1 second, because you might be saying, well, I'm more of a, agreeable person. I think people interested in Buddhism are probably leaning towards the agreeable side. And so so here, for agreeable people who are already empathic, already compassionate in their relationships, these exercises don't help so much. So the kindness condition, we see some benefits immediately. Well, some not so much. First of all, they're better off at baseline. They're already less depressed and they bounce back over time. This hasn't changed really, I think, the repertoire of behaviors. In other words, this is not the activity they needed, most likely. So this is what I mean when I talk about person-activity fit. You want to bring the right intervention and target it towards the deficits. But I would have to say, having been a student of Buddhism now, I find that, this kind of research remains superficial on some level. I think that the compassion that we're talking about in the Mahayana tradition is much deeper and much more experiential and fundamentally non-conditional. And so, I hesitate a bit presenting these kind of quick fixes, but still it's where the literature is at. So I just wanted to end with this. Somewhere an orangutan became best friend with a dog, which is just a funny way of saying we could be friends, and probably this would enhance our collective well-being and our personal well-being. So that's it for me. And I'm happy to take questions. I didn't see faces on the screen, so I don't have much of a sense if I've lost participants or not. But anyway, this is it.
Myriam, why don't you undo, there you go. And people can put up their hands either physically or virtually. Thank you very much, Myriam. That was really wonderful. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, really wonderful.
There's a lot to be said about every single slide. I mean, I could have gone into more detail, but it gives you an idea of where the science is at. And there are more and more studies, that are showing the benefits of compassion for the provider, not just for the recipient. So,
we have a lot of AA people here. They don't have to identify, but I've been reading the big book, And it's so in tune with what you have been saying, that people who are incredibly depressed and alcoholic and reaching the end of their rope with self-destructive alcoholic behavior, and then they find AA, in these stories of the turnarounds, and one of the things that helps them so much is of being of benefit to others.
Yeah.
And this is what allows, and I'm sure you must have done some work with this or be aware of this, and it's so dramatic, that being of service to others for an alcoholic helps them turn around and come back to life.
Well, their relationships are very fragmented as well when they come into AA. And I am very familiar with the 12-step program, and service to others, I think, rules, it goes across perspectives, religions, world wisdoms. Like Martin Luther King said, life's most persistent and urgent question, what are you doing for others? The Dalai Lama said, if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion.
Mm.
And even in the Proverbs, the Christian Bible says, he who has mercy on the poor, happy is he. So this has been it's been recognized as a very fundamental perspective, attitude, virtue. So very wise. And I think as I'm experiencing more of the teachings experientially, when you forget yourself, you really start to live. And my intention initially with testing those exercises, even before Buddhism, was that people who are suffering from depression are very self-absorbed and too self-focused, and the acts of kindness was intended to take them out into the world, into bring their attention towards a significant other or someone in their environment, even strangers, and start to experience something different than their own negative self-talk. Anyway, so this is the background.
Wonderful, thank you.
Kurt
start with
has
Meg.
raised a hand.
Okay.
It's Meg.
It's me. Are you taking questions, I should ask?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I had a question. I once had a therapist who said that she will not, once she determines that her patient is a narcissist, she will not work with them because there's no cure, basically, in so many words. And I wondered what your opinion is on that. If you're a narcissist, you'll always be a narcissist.
I've worked with narcissists, and you might not change the narcissism, but you might help them see that they have everything to gain by keeping harmonious relationships. Because when they show up in therapy, they are depressed and they've experienced some ostracism, and they might not ever become fully self-transparent in therapy, but I still think there's something you can do to help them and to help their relationships. I think with more intensive practice, I'm sure there's been narcissists who started practicing Buddhism and who were transformed. I mean, that self-transformation is possible, but I think that psychotherapists could be weary, and the kind of change that you might expect has to be adjusted. The expectations have to be adjusted. My own goal is always to alleviate the suffering in the client. And yeah.
Okay,
But
thanks.
yeah, most of the time though, we see the children or relatives of narcissists or psychopaths. We see the offspring mostly suffering from that in their parent. What's what I've seen the most in therapy.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you.
David Karamijian and then Michael or Sue.
Let me, am I unmuted?
You are.
Good. Very simple, basic question. Has any studies been done as to what the effect of purely physical exercises are? Whether they be the traditional ones, for example, either Tai Chi or yoga or, just the pure physical activity, the physical gesture that enables people to break through their contactlessness, to break through their own self-imprisonment. Because I know this is prescribed in a lot of cases and it's fairly efficient. But I wondered if you had encountered that in any of your researches.
Yeah, there was I was the editor for one special issue on the science of compassion, and one of the articles was on martial arts and the regulation of the parasympathetic nervous system, meaning controlling the breath. And I don't know which type of martial art, but it was about also relating to your opponent in a certain way and handling conflict in a certain way. But certainly they were claiming that the practice would increase compassion in addition to increasing some of the physiological conditions that are necessary for compassion to arise, meaning regulating a nervous system and improving mindfulness as well. So there's some truth to that.
Yeah, it occurs to me also that depression is usually very simplistically defined as an aggression directed to oneself. Now, if you can reverse that, demand that a depressive go into a martial arts discipline and actually get out there and move and start hitting people, or just going through the gestures of that, it reverses the direction of the aggression, and it projects it outward, which in a way is a method of contacting people.
Yeah, I guess you're saying it would be cathartic.
Yeah.
It could be cathartic. I think in that paper that I saw, that article, it was also a way of being both cooperative with the opponent and managing the adversarial nature of the sport, right? Because you got to come out friends, and it has to be you have to maintain the cooperation and connection with the other. So yeah, and in short, I think yes, it's showing promise, those martial arts.
Yeah, it can be very dramatic. Even in Tai Chi instruction, the pupils are very early introduced to the simple discipline of push hands, for example, which really is remarkable in the way that it brings them into contact by means of a physical gesture with somebody else. And that relationship is reinforced.
Well, the isolation that depressed people report, right? The utter feeling of alienation, right there, you're taking care of it. So it might operate on many different levels, I think.
Yeah, I wonder the question of efficiency as to how quickly these methods would work and how long they would last. Of course, that's the important question, it would seem to me. How long does an improvement last that's been induced by a given methodology?
Well, all you need is for the depression to remit, right? You want to get out of that episode. So anyway, that's a bigger question, I think. There might be data coming out on that. I wouldn't be surprised.
Michael, Sue, did you have a comment?
I did.
So first of all, thank you for the presentation. It's been a long time since I've done or read this kind of research, and it's interesting to see it again. In working with depressed people myself, because I've always found there's like a circularity that you have to get around. I'm not doing anything because I'm depressed, and I'm depressed because I'm not doing anything. And if you wait for the mood to lift, you're never going to do anything. So it's not surprising to me that action would have a positive effect. But I think the strength of the positive effect and the duration of it was surprising. What I'm wondering is, did you ever consider combining both the loving kindness meditation and the acts of kindness as an intervention as opposed to the separation of the two, and see if that made a difference of any kind?
Yeah, yeah, they had to be separated to compare and contrast them in terms of effectiveness. If I had lots of research money right now, I might conduct that kind of study or have a more comprehensive compassion training program. But I wanted to add that there are compassionate mind training therapies now. And specific, also there's another cognitively based compassion therapy, which is based on Buddhist principles and has modules, and it goes over 10 weeks. Every week, participants are developing skills of mindfulness, what we're doing ourselves, but it's a little more intense. It's a little more time and consuming, and it lasts for a longer period of time. And I think that would have more lasting effects, although these kinds of therapies may not be available to everyone. But when it comes to brief interventions, yeah, I think that with the loving kindness meditation, some people liked it and others did not. So, it's like finding the right fit. For us, it would make sense, right? That we like to practice the Tonglen, and it comes more naturally. But if you're a very disagreeable person and you're fundamentally hostile, and especially if you're more introverted and you don't like people that much, it might feel forced to say the statements, may you be happy, may you be safe, may you be at peace. They might not feel it, but if they get into a change in their behaviors with a significant other, and they see the other smiling at them, and as opposed to being angry with them, all of a sudden there's a rapprochement, they get close again. This is how I think it worked, is that they felt it enabled them to feel more connected, when in fact there had been a lot of disconnection before.
And hopefully there was some reciprocity in others' response as well that was probably helpful too. But I think the thing with Tonglen is that at some point it has to carry over into the world. It's, not just, a practice that you just, and then there was a book in the 60s, the title is, I can't remember, but it had a great line that the problem with churches is that people come out feeling they've done something holy, and instead they should come out feeling like doing something holy. And I think Tonglen kind of at some point has to have that kind of activating effect, that you actually, bring compassion out of the practice, or out of just the practice and into your whole life, into the world.
Yeah, well, there's some studies that have found that compassionate training, and they've looked at the brain of people who are doing this kind of training over a certain amount of time, and on a fairly intensive basis, and they found that later it was related to altruistic action in the real world. There was one early study that found that. So you would expect that it would carry over.
I think it does. Yeah.
Max, you had a question or a comment?
Well, thanks very much. Yeah, really interesting talk. I thought it was fascinating, and I found myself sort of wondering in terms of the terms empathy and compassion, because I've heard in like in some of the helping, like some people in the helping professions, like therapists, social workers, and so on, who sort of work directly with people. I've heard it sort of described before by, in some senses, where people said, I want to avoid too much empathy and instead use compassion. And what they seemed to be sort of differentiating with that was empathy as in just feeling the pain of another person, and then it was weighing them down and sort of leading to a lot of personal burden for them. Whereas they were sort of associating the term compassion with what they described as sort of a more, being more integral within themselves and being less affected by the other's pain and yet still able to help somehow. I thought that was interesting, but I wasn't sure if that correlates with sort of in the academic sense of describing empathy or compassion. I wasn't sure if that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So empathy is like feeling, it's like your mirror neurons are firing. When you see suffering in the other, you kind of experience kind of what they're feeling. You have that sense of, oh, I know what they're experiencing. And you know, therapists and caregivers really need to have good boundaries in terms of feeling what it's like for the other, but not necessarily drowning with it, not necessarily becoming consumed by it. So you can have empathic distress, what you were saying, but empathy doesn't need to be it's necessary for compassion. In other words, you know that the other person's suffering, you know what it's like, but with compassion, you also approach, you get closer, you get engaged because you want and you know how to alleviate their suffering. You are engaged in sort of a loving, caring reaction, which is really the helpful part. And that's the part that feels good, is the caring response. So you're not running from the distress, but you're acting on it with agency, with a sense of, oh, you know, let me show them that I'm here and that I do care. And so it's different from empathy in that it's not just the resonance, but it's also the motivation to alleviate the suffering. And I think that when you're there, it's perceived as more helpful, and it's also feels better for the provider.
Makes sense.
There's these reward hormones that are secreted during compassionate actions. Like it literally feels good for the provider because it increases bonding, and somehow it's like taking care of a child. You know, it stems from the same sort of basic system, caring system of appeasing distress in another, and it has rewarding qualities.
Trip.
Yeah, thank you, Myriam. That was interesting and thought-provoking. I've got a question for you. With the intensity of messaging and negativity that people are absorbing, you know, just by reading the news, through social media, are there studies being done, and is there any insight into how that kind of daily exposure, like a verifiable impact on people's ability to demonstrate compassion, for example, to work against the physiology of compassion?
So what you're saying is that a daily diet of the news might make you less compassionate, a little more?
Well, yeah. I mean, are there studies being done to see if it is, you know, resulting in the negativity that I think most of us feel and see and witness? If there's a verifiable impact.
Well, I don't know of any studies that's looked at the number of minutes that you consume the news, for example, and then the person becoming more apathetic and less likely to intervene because it's so discouraging and it's like nothing can help, we're doomed. I don't know of any studies of that, but I know that social media, exposure to social media in teens is associated with greater depression. And so that's why there's been caution against being too absorbed in that. And I, there's a doctor who published a paper in that special issue that I mentioned earlier, and somebody put it in the chat too, the link to it, which is great. But he decided, he was a doctor working in pediatrics and was really getting down, like depressed from watching the news. And he said, this was just reminding me of how terrible people can be, or how, like it's giving you a certain perspective on human nature. And it was so discouraging. He decided to do something about it. And he started putting up images of kindness and compassion in his waiting room where people wait for an appointment. And so he had this media, kind of like pictures of kindness and examples of compassion, and exposed the patients to that in the waiting room. And he found that it had an impact. So what you expose yourself to probably will impact your mood. But I think that also you could have some discernment and also know that, intellectually recognize that some things are disproportionately presented in the news, that it's a disproportionate of the sensational, the bad, the wow, kinds of news, and that there is such a large amount of examples of, good aspects to human nature that never get publicized. And so you have to remember that, and I think be judicious about your consumption. You want to know what's going on.
Right.
But at the same time, I like to watch different channels, not just American channels, but broader networks, to get a sense for other things in the world. So yeah, but yeah, I would say you have to remember that's not everything. There's countless acts of heroism, altruism, courage, compassion that happen every day. It's just not newsworthy.
Right.
So
right. Yeah, I think what I'm just driving at is how the messaging in the public realm can really work against some of the interventions that you're talking about. And I guess my curiosity is if that's kind of part of the recipe for helping people work through whatever issue they're dealing with, depression related issues, if part of the package, would include shutting off, turning off and separating from, the fuel of negativity.
Well, so there you're getting at public campaigns possibly to change. I mean, this is broader, but you'd want to introduce other messaging and somehow, broaden the focus for, what's given to the public. But I don't know that the news are going to stop being slanted towards the, and so maybe shutting off. I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
It remains to be tested.
Thank you.
Well, perhaps we need to draw this meeting to a close. It's getting late. Are there any other comments that people want to make or questions asked before we close? And if not, Myriam, thank you so much. It was really, really wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, really.
My comment also, Myriam, thank you so much for
Oh, no, thanks, Ellen.
so inspiring and for really giving your time and your expertise to all of us.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that.
And
No, it's my pleasure.
yeah, and people are putting their thank yous in chat. So thanks very much. So we'll close with the Buddhist closing chants. Xinyi, if you will lead us. I'll put them on the screen. These are the dedication of merit. We dedicate the merit generated by our practice and by this wonderful meeting to the benefit of all sentient beings. And here we go. Oops. We'll start here with a prayer for peace.
By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit may all obtain omniscience, may he defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the victim's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Thank you, everybody, and in particular, thank you, Myriam.